Welcome to the Ancient Crumbs, the channel where we explore the history of food and drink from around the world. Each episode, we uncover the surprising ways that everyday flavors carry centuries of stories, shaping traditions, cultures, and even the course of history. Because food isn't just sustenance, it's memory, it's community, it's ritual, and every sip or bite connects us to a deeper, older story. Today, we turn our attention to one of the most beloved and influential drinks of all time, coffee. Coffee is everywhere. It greets us in the morning, steaming on the bedside table, or clutched tightly on the commute. It lingers in the air of busy cafes, where conversations hum like background music. It keeps us company during long nights of work or study, and it punctuates afternoons with a gentle pause. But coffee's story is not just a story of a drink. It's a story of empires, of ideas, of revolutions whispered over small tables. It's a story that begins with legend and spreads across continents, reshaping economies, fueling creativity, and, in many ways, changing the way the modern world functions. When we talk about coffee, we're not just talking about what's inside the cup. We're talking about centuries of history, myths of dancing goats in Ethiopia, Sufi mystics in Yemen, the smoky chatter of Ottoman coffeehouses, the political sparks lit in London cafes, and the artistry of Italian espresso bars. So the question is, how did a bitter little bean come to stir so much of human history? In this episode of the Ancient Crumbs, we'll follow coffee's journey from its legendary discovery to its rise as a global cultural force. We'll explore the role of coffeehouses as gathering places for poets, rebels, and merchants. We'll look at the rituals, from Ethiopian coffee ceremonies to the morning cappuccino in Rome, that have made coffee more than just a beverage. And as we travel through time, we'll pause to reflect on why coffee matters to us today, why a simple cup continues to feel both universal and deeply personal. By the end, you may find yourself looking at your next sip with a little more wonder. Like many foods with ancient roots, coffee's story begins in myth. The most famous tale takes us to the Ethiopian highlands, centuries ago. Imagine the air cool and crisp, the slopes green with shrubs and wildflowers. A young goat herd named Kaldi noticed something peculiar. After nibbling the bright red cherries of a certain plant, his goats began to leap and prance with unusual energy. They refused to sleep, bleating and bounding through the night. Curious, Kaldi tried the fruit himself. Soon he too felt a sudden clarity, awake, alert, energized in a way he had never known. He brought the cherries to a nearby monastery. The monks, suspicious, tossed them into the fire. But as the seeds roasted, an aroma rose that stopped them in their tracks. Rich, nutty, unlike anything they had smelled before. They raked the glowing beans from the embers, ground them, and brewed them in hot water. And so, the story goes, the first cup of coffee was made. Now, was Kaldi real? Probably not. But legends often carry truths hidden in their poetry. What this myth tells us is that coffee's earliest associations were tied to alertness, to wakefulness, qualities that would define its place in human life. From these highlands, coffee's journey begins, but it is in Yemen, across the Red Sea, that the bean would first become both a ritual and a global commodity. Before coffeehouses and crowded chatter, before trade routes and revolutions, coffee lived first in the stillness of prayer. Picture Yemen in the 15th century. The air is dry, scented with frankincense and myrrh. The Red Sea laps against the port of Mocha, a city destined to give its name to the drink itself. And in the hills and valleys, among the white-walled mosques and shrines, Sufi mystics gathered. For the Sufis, prayer was not a short ritual, but an all-night devotion. They sought closeness to the divine through recitation, chanting, and meditation that sometimes stretched until dawn. But bodies grow tired, eyelids heavy even when the spirit yearns to keep vigil. Coffee became their ally. The Sufis drank it not to chatter, but to concentrate. They believed the drink opened the mind, sharpened memory, and even deepened their sense of spiritual presence. One Sufi poet described coffee as the drink of those who truly seek God, which banishes sleep and brings visions to the heart. Imagine a circle of worshippers in the flicker of lamplight, their cups passing quietly, hand to hand, the dark liquid warming their palms. The taste was sharp, almost medicinal, but it carried with it the power to transform drowsiness into wakeful devotion. From these sacred circles, coffee moved outward into everyday life. Merchants traveling through Yemen discovered its powers. Pilgrims on their way to Mecca carried the habit with them. Soon, the port of Mocha became the hub of the world's coffee trade. For nearly 2 centuries, Yemen held a monopoly on coffee cultivation, carefully guarding the plant from being grown elsewhere. It is no coincidence, then, that the earliest coffee houses often carried a spiritual undertone. They weren't merely businesses, they were extensions of the Sufi tradition, places where the drink was linked not only with stimulation, but with reflection, with conversation that sought meaning. In fact, early critics who tried to ban coffee sometimes accused it of being a Sufi drug. And in a way, they were right. Coffee had been born in prayer, nurtured in devotion, and released into the world as a tool for focus and presence. Now imagine walking through the narrow, bustling streets of Cairo in the early 1500s. The calls of vendors rise above the crowd. Horses and donkeys clatter over the stones. Spices, cinnamon, cumin, black pepper scent the air. But tucked between the stalls and homes, you notice something new. A place glowing with lantern light, filled with the hum of voices and the steam of a strange, dark drink. This is one of the world's first cafe khane, a coffee house. Step inside, and the scene is almost overwhelming. The room is crowded, but not in an uncomfortable way. Men sit cross-legged on cushions, cups in hand. Some are listening intently as a storyteller recites tales of heroes and kings. Others argue in spirited tones over poetry or politics. Musicians strum the oud, their melodies weaving in and out of the laughter. And everywhere, the smell of roasted beans, bitter, earthy, slightly sweet, mixes with incense and smoke. It is not a tavern, not a mosque, not a marketplace. It is something entirely different, a place to be together, to exchange ideas, to feel part of something larger. Coffee houses quickly became known as schools of the wise. Why? Because unlike formal schools or private salons, they were open to nearly everyone. For the price of a single cup, a merchant could debate with a scholar. A traveler could sit beside a poet. Knowledge, once locked away in elite circles, began to circulate more freely. This was revolutionary, and naturally, it made rulers nervous. In the 16th century, the governor of Mecca, worried that gatherings in coffee houses might stir rebellion, ordered them shut down. Coffee itself was even banned at times, accused of being an intoxicant, though in truth it was the conversations, not the drink, that unsettled authorities. In Istanbul, Sultan Murad IV went further. He feared that the lively debates in coffee houses were breeding grounds for dissent. His response? He outlawed coffee entirely. Legend has it that he even patrolled the streets in disguise, executing those caught drinking it. But bans never lasted long. People craved their coffee and the spaces that came with it. In fact, each attempt to shut down coffee houses only seemed to confirm their importance as centers of free thought. One Ottoman chronicler observed that despite the dangers, men of all ranks flocked to the coffee houses. Why? Because they were places where life itself was discussed. Politics, philosophy, poetry, love. They were where ideas could spark and spread, fueled not by alcohol's haze, but by coffee's clarity. And that's a key difference. Unlike taverns, which dulled the senses, coffee houses sharpened them. The drink didn't make you sleepy or sluggish. It kept you alert, eager, ready to listen and respond. This is why some European writers later called them penny universities. For the price of a single cup, you could hear lectures, join debates, or simply absorb the flow of conversation. Coffee houses were also places of performance. Professional storytellers, known as hakawati, would hold audiences wrapped with epics and folktales. Poets would recite verses, sometimes improvising to the mood of the crowd. Even shadow puppetry found a home in these lively spaces. In many ways, coffee houses blurred the line between private and public life. They were not homes, yet they felt intimate. They were not theaters, yet they entertained. They were not classrooms, yet they educated. And most importantly, they gave ordinary people a seat at the table of ideas. By the end of the 1500s, coffee houses had spread throughout the Ottoman Empire, from Cairo to Damascus to Istanbul, and were shaping a new kind of public life. A life in which information, stories, and opinions could be shared outside the walls of palaces and mosques. And from there, Coffee's journey was just beginning, because once merchants and travelers carried it to Europe, the humble coffeehouse would ignite revolutions, both intellectual and political. Imagine the bustling port of Venice in the early 1600s. The Adriatic air is thick with salt and spice. Ships from the Ottoman Empire unload carpets, silks, and sacks of unfamiliar goods. Among them, small bundles of dark, aromatic beans, coffee. Venice was Europe's gateway to the East, and so it was here that many Italians first tasted this strange drink. It arrived with a reputation: exotic, bitter, invigorating. But as with many things unfamiliar, it also arrived with suspicion. Some church authorities called it the bitter invention of Satan. They saw the dark, stimulating brew as dangerous, a possible threat to both health and morality. Yet the drink spread too quickly to be ignored, and so the debate rose higher until it reached the Vatican. According to one story, Pope Clement VIII himself was asked to condemn coffee, but before passing judgment, he requested a taste. The Pope lifted the cup, sipped, and paused. Then he reportedly smiled and declared, "This drink is so delicious it would be a sin to let only infidels drink it. We shall baptize it." Whether apocryphal or not, the tale captures a turning point. Coffee, once suspect, soon found favor among Europeans. By the mid-1600s, it was flowing not only in Venice, but in London, Paris, and Vienna, each city giving coffee a new role in public life. If Venice introduced coffee to Europe, London made it a way of life. The first coffee house opened in Oxford in 1650, followed by one in London 2 years later. Soon the city was dotted with them, lively, crowded, and brimming with conversation. For a penny, you could buy a cup of coffee and entry into a world of ideas. People began calling them penny universities because for such a small price, you could hear debates on politics, science, philosophy, or trade. Step inside one of these London coffee houses and you might overhear Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, or Christopher Wren arguing over natural philosophy. At another table, merchants pooled information about ships, prices, and trade. And in fact, from this chatter grew institutions like Lloyd's of London, which began as a coffee house frequented by shipowners and insurers. But not everyone loved these new gathering places. One pamphlet published in 1674, written notably by a group of women, complained that coffee made men useless with talk and impotent in the bedchamber. They claimed husbands spent more time gossiping in coffee houses than at home with their families. King Charles II also saw them as dangerous, fearing they were hotbeds of sedition. In 1675, he issued a proclamation to shut them all down, but the outcry was so fierce that within days he reversed his decision. Coffee had taken root in London and nothing could stop it. If London's coffee houses were rowdy, Parisian cafes were elegant. The first opened in 1672 when an Armenian merchant began selling coffee near the fairground of Saint-Germain. But the real boom came in 1686 when Francesco Procopio de Coltelli, a Sicilian, founded Le Procope. Le Procope quickly became legendary. Imagine the flicker of chandeliers, marble tables, mirrors, and walls lined with books. Here, intellectuals and artists gathered. Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, later even Napoleon. Voltaire was said to drink as many as 40 cups a day, fueling his razor-sharp wit with endless streams of coffee. Parisian cafes became salons of the people, accessible to more than just the aristocracy. They were places where the Enlightenment brewed, literally and figuratively. Pamphlets were read aloud, philosophies debated, revolutions whispered. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, cafes were among the first places where citizens gathered to voice their discontent. Vienna's coffee story begins with a legend of war. In 1683, after the Battle of Vienna, sacks of coffee were supposedly left behind by the retreating Ottoman army. A man named Georg Franz Kolschitsky, who had lived among the Ottomans and knew their language, claimed the sacks. With them, he opened one of Vienna's first coffee houses. The Viennese added their own twist: milk, honey, and sweet pastries alongside the bitter brew. Soon, coffee houses spread through the city, becoming cornerstones of Viennese culture. By the 19th century, these cafes were second homes for writers, artists, and musicians. Sigmund Freud, Gustav Klimt, and countless others sipped coffee in these spaces, shaping ideas that would ripple through the modern world. To this day, Vienna's coffee houses, with their marble tables, newspapers on brass stands, and the gentle clink of porcelain, remain part of UNESCO's cultural heritage. Across Europe, coffee provoked strong reactions. Some saw it as a miracle drink, sharpening the mind and fueling progress. Others feared it was corrupting morals or undermining order. But whether in London's penny universities, Parisian cafes, or Viennese salons, one thing was clear: coffee was becoming Europe's drink of ideas. Unlike alcohol, which dulled conversation, coffee quickened it. It invited debate, sharpened wit, and brought people together in ways that would reshape culture and politics alike. By the 1700s, coffee houses were not just places to drink. They were crucibles of change. Revolutions, philosophies, and even businesses were born over cups of coffee. And soon, this dark liquid would leap across the Atlantic, planting its roots in the New World. By the 17th and 18th centuries, coffee was no longer just an Ottoman or European curiosity. It had become a global commodity, carried on ships, planted in new soils, shaping entire economies and societies. And like all global stories, it carried both wonder and shadow. The Dutch were among the first Europeans to break Yemen's coffee monopoly. In the 1600s, they smuggled live plants out of Arabia and began cultivating them in their colonies. By the early 1700s, coffee trees were thriving on the island of Java in Indonesia. The name Java soon became synonymous with the drink itself, a nickname that still lingers today. Picture the scene: tropical rains drumming on palm leaves, the earthy smell of freshly picked cherries, workers hauling sacks of beans through humid plantations. From these distant fields, the Dutch East India Company shipped beans back to Amsterdam, fueling Europe's growing addiction. In the process, coffee was no longer just a drink of mystics or philosophers. It had become a crop, a commodity, a business. From Java, coffee traveled west. A French naval officer, Gabriel de Clio, carried a single plant from the Royal Botanical Gardens in Paris across the Atlantic in 1720. According to legend, he guarded it fiercely through storms and pirates, even sharing his meager ration of water with the fragile seedling. That plant survived, and in time gave birth to millions of coffee trees in the Caribbean. On islands like Martinique and Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, coffee found fertile soil. By the mid-18th century, Saint-Domingue alone supplied half the world's coffee. But this came at a terrible cost. Plantations were worked by enslaved Africans, forced into backbreaking labor under brutal conditions. The sweet aroma rising from European coffee houses was, in truth, underwritten by human suffering thousands of miles away. Then came Brazil. In the early 1700s, smuggled seeds made their way into Portuguese hands. Over the next century, coffee spread across the vast landscapes of Brazil. By the 1800s, the country had become the world's largest producer, a title it still holds today. Vast plantations stretched across hillsides, whole economies bending around the bean. Brazil's wealth grew, but again, it was built first on slavery and later on waves of immigrant labor. For many workers, the steaming cup that symbolized leisure and conversation in Europe was, on the ground, the product of sweat, hardship, and survival. Coffee also spread east. The British cultivated it in India while the Dutch expanded into Sumatra and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. Later, the French planted it in Vietnam, where it took on a life of its own. Even today, Vietnam is one of the world's top producers, famous for its strong Robusta beans and unique traditions like iced coffee with condensed milk, a sweet, bold echo of colonial history transformed into something distinctly local. By the 19th century, coffee was everywhere, in European cafes, in Ottoman courtyards, in colonial plantations, in the breakfast cups of Americans. It was no longer just a drink of mystics or intellectuals. It was a drink of the world, universal, everyday, woven into the fabric of modern life. But with that universality came contradiction. Coffee was both comfort and exploitation, both freedom and bondage, both connection and empire. To sip a cup was to taste not only bitterness and sweetness, but the tangled history of humanity itself. Beyond trade and empires, coffee's story deepened in the rituals it inspired. Before coffee became a modern habit, before the drive-through cups, the sleek machines, and the latte art, It was, and still is, a ritual. Across continents, people have shaped coffee into their own ceremonies, each reflecting something essential about how they live, gather, and find meaning. This is the quiet heart of coffee's story. Not the trade routes or the empires, but the gestures, the pouring, the waiting, the first sip shared among friends or family. In Ethiopia, where coffee's legend began, the drink remains a sacred act of hospitality. The Buna Maflat, or coffee ceremony, is a ritual of patience and presence. Green coffee beans are washed and roasted over hot coals while guests gather around. The air fills with smoke and the deep, nutty aroma of roasting beans, a scent that announces warmth and welcome. The hostess fans the smoke toward her guests as an invitation to share in the experience. The beans are ground by hand and brewed in a black clay pot called a jabina. Then, the coffee is poured in 3 rounds: abol, tona, and baraka, each slightly weaker, each more intimate. The final round, baraka, means blessing. To stay through all 3 is to be honored as part of the household. Here, coffee isn't a drink. It's time itself, stretched, savored, shared. In Italy, coffee became rhythm, a heartbeat in the day. Morning begins not with a meal, but with a ritual at the bar. The hiss of steam, the clink of porcelain, the swift exchange of greetings. All of it happens in minutes, yet it holds the grace of tradition. A cappuccino, taken before 11 a.m., marks the morning. An espresso after lunch is a punctuation mark. Italians rarely carry their coffee away. They stand, sip, and move on. It's the same every day, yet never the same twice. That moment at the counter, brief, fragrant, precise, connects people across generations. Farther east, coffee carries a whisper of mystery. In Turkey, the sezve, a small copper pot, simmers finely ground coffee and sugar until it foams. The thick, strong drink is poured into tiny cups unfiltered. When the coffee is gone, the cup is turned upside down onto the saucer and left to cool. When lifted, the coffee grounds have settled into shapes and lines, and from them, a fortune can be read. Love, luck, travel, friendship, the symbols swirl like constellations in the dregs. Whether or not one believes the predictions hardly matters. What matters is the ritual itself, the conversation, the laughter, the shared wonder of what the future might hold in a simple cup. In Vienna, the coffee house became a second home. You sit at a marble table, unfold a newspaper, and no one rushes you. A single cup comes with a glass of water, an unspoken invitation to stay as long as you wish. Writers, artists, and thinkers spent whole afternoons here, lost in thought and conversation. The Viennese cafe is not about the coffee alone, it's about the act of being. To sit, to watch, to think, that too is a ritual. Ethiopia's ceremony, Italy's counter, Turkey's fortune-telling, Vienna's lingering afternoon. These rituals seem worlds apart, yet they share a truth. Coffee, wherever it's brewed, creates pause. It gathers people into moments that might otherwise pass unnoticed. And though the tools and tastes differ, the essence is the same: warmth, connection, reflection. These are the threads that have woven coffee into the fabric of daily life. From here, the story will return to the modern age, to the machines, the chains, the trends, but the rituals endure underneath it all, grounding us in the simple act of pouring, sipping, and sharing. By the dawn of the 20th century, coffee was no longer exotic. It had become a daily necessity for millions. The challenge now was not how to spread coffee, but how to adapt it to a rapidly changing world. Industrialization, global trade, and new technologies would transform coffee yet again, from the invention of instant coffee to the rise of the espresso machine, and finally, to the modern coffee culture we know today. The first great shift came with speed. In 1901, a Japanese chemist named Satoru Kato developed the first successful method for making soluble coffee, what we now call instant coffee. During World War I and later World War II, instant coffee became a soldier's staple. Easy to transport, easy to brew, and fast. It offered warmth and alertness on the battlefield, a small comfort in unimaginable conditions. After the wars, instant coffee stuck. It became a symbol of modern efficiency, fitting neatly into the new rhythms of office life and suburban mornings. For some, it was progress. For others, a flattening of flavor and ritual. But either way, coffee was no longer bound to cafes, it had entered every kitchen. Meanwhile, in Italy, another revolution was steaming. In 1901, Luigi Bezzera patented a machine that forced hot water through finely ground coffee under pressure. The result was espresso, a short, concentrated shot with a thick layer of crema on top. Espresso wasn't just a new way of brewing, it was a new culture. Bars in Milan, Rome, and Naples filled with workers grabbing their quick morning shot. The hiss of steam, the clink of cups on the counter, the rhythm of standing, sipping, and leaving. This became the heartbeat of Italian daily life. Over time, espresso spread abroad, carrying with it a distinctly Italian sense of coffee as both art and necessity. By the late 20th century, coffee had taken yet another leap. Large coffee chains, most famously Starbucks, began to reshape the landscape of how people drank coffee. No longer just a morning ritual, coffee became an all-day event, customizable with syrups, sizes, and endless variations. For some, this democratized coffee culture, making cafes accessible social spaces around the world. For others, it symbolized a kind of commercialization. Coffee turned into lifestyle branding. Either way, the cafe became once again what it had been in the Ottoman and European eras, a public square, a place to meet, to work, to linger. In response, a new movement arose in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the so-called third wave of coffee. This movement treated coffee not as a commodity or a caffeine delivery system, but as a craft, something to be savored like wine. Baristas became artisans. Roasters began to highlight single origin beans, celebrating the distinct flavors of Ethiopia, Colombia, Guatemala, and beyond. Brewing methods like pour-over, AeroPress, and siphon emphasized clarity and precision, and coffee drinkers began to ask new questions. Where was this grown? Who harvested it? Was it traded fairly? This third wave was both aesthetic and ethical, a call to reconnect with the bean itself and with the people behind it. Today, coffee is at once universal and personal. It fuels commutes and quiet mornings, boardrooms and bedrooms, conversations and solitude. It is both the global commodity traded on stock markets and the intimate ritual of a single cup brewed at home. Whether it's instant coffee in a thermos, an espresso at the counter in Rome, or a carefully crafted pour-over in a trendy cafe, each cup links us to centuries of history, from Sufi mystics to Enlightenment thinkers, from enslaved laborers on plantations to modern-day baristas. Coffee has carried with it both the weight of the world and the warmth of human connection. And so, we return to the cup, the steam rising, the aroma curling through the air, the pause before the first sip. Coffee, more than any other drink, holds stories. Stories of devotion and discovery, of trade and toil, of art and everyday life. It began as a gift from the earth, found among goats in the Ethiopian highlands. It became the companion of Sufi mystics seeking wakeful prayer, the spark in Ottoman coffeehouses where poetry and politics mingled, the fuel for Enlightenment salons and revolutionary thought. It crossed oceans on ships, planted itself in distant soils, and carried both comfort and complexity to every corner of the globe. And through it all, coffee has been the same at its core, a reason to gather, a reason to reflect, a reason to stay awake not just in body, but in spirit. In a world that moves ever faster, coffee still asks us to pause, to listen, to breathe in its warmth and remember that connection across time, across place, can begin with something as small as a shared cup. How many mornings has it watched the sun rise with us? How many quiet moments has it witnessed, waiting patiently beside open books and quiet hearts? So wherever you are and whatever your ritual, an espresso at dawn, a mug on your desk, a pot shared among friends, take a moment to taste the story inside it, because every cup of coffee is, in its own quiet way, a reminder of how deeply human we all are. Thank you for listening to The Ancient Crumbs, where food and drink become windows into history. If you enjoyed this journey through coffee's past and present, I would love to hear from you. Share a thought, a memory, or your favorite way to take your coffee in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.